she was born in a gulag because both her parents had ended up there. Okay, that's pretty bad, right? Well, how did they both end up there? Her mother ended up there because her husband had been taken away by the secret police. And she left her 3-month-old baby or 6-month-old baby, I don't remember the age, with a neighbor and went to inquire after him. And of course, she never came back. She was imprisoned as well because she was the wife of an enemy of the people.
Konstantin Kisin was born in the Soviet Union in 1982. He came to Britain at the age of 11 and has since developed a highly successful career in social media and as a commentator. With Francis Foster, he created a channel on YouTube called Trigonometry, which now has 1.3 million subscribers and growing. He also wrote a book, An Immigrant's Love Letter to the West, which immediately got onto the Sunday Times bestseller list. Konstantin, thank you very much for making the time for this interview.
No, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure.
We'll get to the big picture a bit later. The big picture such as what is it about communism that means it usually ends up in totalitarian terror? But first, I would like to ask you about your personal story. Where were you born and where did you grow up?
So I was born in Moscow in 1982, and I grew up for the first 4 years of my life in Moscow. This was still the Soviet Union, obviously, in 82. Then my family moved to Uzbekistan, where my father was born, and we lived there for 4 years. So I experienced Soviet Uzbekistan for 4 years. Actually, my dad and I went back to Uzbekistan recently and saw the way that it's been transformed since. And for the first, so that would be probably 9 years of my life, I lived in various parts of the Soviet Union, then modern Russia, and then eventually my parents sent me to school in England, and that was my childhood.
And give us an idea of how far away where you were in Uzbekistan is from Moscow.
It's probably about 5 hours flight, I would say. So Uzbekistan is in Central Asia, and we lived in the capital, Tashkent. So it was interesting because the Soviet Union was such a powerful force in all the countries that it controlled that while we were obviously living in a different country, the majority of the population were Uzbeks and not Russians. Nonetheless, the difference was, well, I mean, I was a young child as well, but the difference was pretty small in those days. And even now it's interesting going back to Uzbekistan because there's quite a lot of people there who actually, they feel at least the legacy of the Soviet Union was not all bad for them in some ways, particularly when it comes to the suppression of extremist religions and so on. It's an interesting place.
So where did you go to school? What sort of school was it?
It was one of there was only one type of school in the Soviet Union, and it was just an ordinary, what you'd call a state school here. So I did the first 2 years of school in Uzbekistan before moving back to Moscow.
And do you remember what kind of teaching you had? Was any of it pro-communist, or was it a totally traditional kind of teaching?
The first 2 years were more about reading and writing and things like that. And you got to remember this is the late 80s now, so the Soviet Union is waning at this point. Nobody really believes it. Everyone sort of pretends to be a communist, but those days of everyone actually being a communist, if they ever were real, they were kind of over. But there were portraits of Lenin everywhere. And we still had the system. I don't know if you saw the interview I did with my dad. We talked about the Oktyabryanki, the little Octoberists, the little the young pioneers, and the Komsomolets as well.
So did you join the little Octoberists?
I did not, because my parents didn't want me to, and by this point it was kind of possible to avoid it, really. It wasn't that big a deal. And so they knew that it was going to be something that was offered, and they kind of managed to keep me out of it.
Yes, you referred elsewhere to the talk. Can you tell me what you mean by the talk? What was the talk you got from your father?
Well, it was my parents both, and it's interesting because when I interviewed my dad, he couldn't remember any of it because perhaps it was so commonplace for him back then. But I remember being told by my parents that it's very important that the things we discuss at home, I don't discuss in school. and that if I were to do that, then both I and they would likely be in trouble, which I think it was objectively true, given that, they think they had questions about some of the things that were going on in society. And so the talk was essentially be very careful about discussing the things we discuss privately here outside the house, particularly at school.
Do you remember actually where you were and what circumstances you got the talk, or what sort of age you were?
I remember that it was still in Uzbekistan, so it probably would have been before I went to school for the first time. So I went to nursery before that, where this wasn't really much of a conversation. But then when I was going to school, I think my parents were just aware that the level of communist kind of indoctrination was likely to be a little bit more. And they just wanted me to be careful of that.
I mean, you're not naturally a non-talkative person, so was this a discipline for you to hold your mouth?
It was not mainly because at 7 years old, I really wasn't that interested in politics or any of this other stuff. So it wasn't just something as the 7-year-old I was particularly concerned about. But yes, I think your broader point stands, which is I generally have a hard time keeping my mouth shut about things.
Yeah. What is your first memory of, in retrospect, of something that was distinctly socialist or communist in your upbringing?
That's an interesting question. Well, I mean, like I say, there were portraits of Lenin everywhere. There was...
Lenin, not Stalin?
No, this was the 1980s. I don't remember really Stalin being particularly talk. He was not... He's made a big comeback in Russia, as you probably know nowadays. But at that point, I don't think he was considered, this unblemished figure. And Lenin was kind of the figure you see everywhere, and Marx too. So all of these words and all these names were very much in the culture. So the biggest streets in the town, whichever town it was, would be Karl Marx Street. And it was just mainly this thing that you absorb as a child, just being surrounded by these figures of the Russian Revolution, of the Soviet Union more generally. But it's not. I don't remember as a 7-year-old being told, we're all good little communists and we are going to be equal and all of this. It wasn't really at that point being indoctrinated into you nearly as much as I think it was in the past.
Yeah. Going back into your family's history, your grandfather, your paternal grandfather, got on the wrong side of the authorities. Can you tell us about that?
Yes. So he had some kind of English language class where they got together and they practiced English. And during one of their discussions, he said something that he wasn't supposed to say. I think, from memory, there's some debate about this because my grandfather's passed away now, and people don't remember necessarily exactly what happened when. But I think what he said was some kind of criticism of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. And obviously, as was always the case in all of these places, there was one guy who reported it immediately to the KGB. And he got into big trouble. He was fired effectively from his job. His wife was fired from her job. And then
what were their jobs?
So he was a physicist, pretty high-level physicist. Actually, he ended up being one of probably the most prominent Russian to English translators of high-level physics documents. So he was a real scientist. And his wife was also in the science, probably, I think she was somewhat less advanced, but she was still working in that area. And they were both effectively prevented from ever pursuing their careers of choice. And then my father...
So what did they do instead if they couldn't pursue that?
So I think my grandmother's career was entirely ended by this, I think, from memory. She certainly never made a career after that. Perhaps children had come along at this point and she just stayed at home. And my grandfather was very lucky in that it was no longer the 50s or the 40s or the 30s, so he wasn't physically punished. He wasn't tortured physically, although I think they deliberately, my father tells the story, that they kept bringing him in for interrogation in the middle of the night, keeping him up all night with all kinds of questions, and then he would have to go to work the following morning, and he couldn't not turn up to work because he'd be fired. And then they did this for weeks at a time, essentially, sort of sleep depriving him. But nonetheless, it was not what was happening in the 30s. And so he eventually was very fortunate that the Soviet Union was coming to an end, and he began to do translations with foreign clients. And this was very, he made more money, I think, doing that than he would have ever done as a scientist.
It's interesting you keep on making the contrast with the 30s, and it's interesting that you had this kind of soft communism,
Yes,
compared to the horrific communism of the Great Terror, but your soft communism wasn't that nice either. Your career of your grandfather was destroyed, that of your grandmother too, for something he had said.
yes.
I mean,
But it's not that unfamiliar to people in the modern West today, is it? The experience of saying something for which you're then punished. The difference is, in those places, like in modern Russia, you'd be punished by the state. Here, you're punished sometimes by society or elements of society. But yes, I think the reason I say this is, people sometimes sort of, I think I was once introduced as a survivor of Soviet communism, which I think is pushing it. I'm keen to make the point that by the 1980s, the regime had lost all sorts of power, and which is why it crumbled very soon afterwards. But the other reason is I don't want to be disrespectful to the experiences and the memories of my grandparents and their parents who actually did suffer. On my mother's side, for example, there were people who starved to death because of things that were done, who were tortured, brutally imprisoned.
Tell us about that. Then.
Well, so my maternal grandmother, still alive, 96 years old, lives in Ukraine right now, 100 kilometers from the front line. I always find it very difficult to tell this story because now that I've become a father as well, it's something that it's difficult to imagine. But when the communists came to their village, they would have been my great-grandparents. So my grandmother was their daughter, and she had a little brother. They had a horse. And this made them kulaks, which I'm sure you know what they were, rich peasants effectively, who were accused by the communists of profiting, of somehow, being taking advantage of other people, because in communism, if you have more, then you are by definition the oppressor. And they were kicked out of the house and deported to Siberia. They had to walk to Siberia, or I don't remember the exact details. And in the process of that, her little brother starved to death because they didn't have food, enough food to keep him alive. So that was one of the things that happened.
So that's your great grandmother.
Yes. So my great uncle, that's my grandmother. So my great uncle was the little boy who starved.
Who starved to death.
Who starved to death.
And that was in Ukraine, or on the way to...
He was on the way to Siberia from Ukraine, yeah. But it's not just, we think about people dying or little children dying, of course it's horrific, but it was also that what ended up happening is the people, just to get it right. So my grandmother's parents, they are obviously all deported as a family. And eventually, my great-grandmother's mother went to Siberia on the train and said, look, keep the husband, he's the man, he deserves the punishment, whatever, he's not a proper communist, whatever, but give me my daughter and granddaughter back. And they somehow let her take them, somehow. I don't know, the story that I've been told doesn't go into the detail. And so, can you imagine? I just think about it as myself. I have a son, I have a wife, right? Imagine we all get deported as a family. Our youngest child starves on the way. And then my mother-in-law comes in after years of us being in Siberia and says, well, at least give me your wife and child. I'll take them back. You stay here, right? And eventually my great-grandfather somehow made it back. I think he walked all the way back from Siberia to Ukraine, is what I was told. He came back with massive wounds on his feet and all sorts of other things. I think he escaped, effectively, right? So imagine, forget just about the misery of people dying, but what about the misery of families, of loved ones being split apart by all this horror? This happened to millions of people in this way. The same on my father's side. So the grandfather that we discussed, who was punished in this way, his wife, I call her my grandmother, but she's his second wife, so we're not blood relations, but she was always my grandmother, really. She was born in a gulag because both her parents had ended up there. Okay, that's pretty bad, right? Well, how did they both end up there? Her mother ended up there because her husband had been taken away by the secret police. And she left her 3-month-old baby or 6-month-old baby, I don't remember the age, with a neighbor and went to inquire after him. And of course, she never came back. She was imprisoned as well because she was the wife of an enemy of the people. So she ended up in a gulag, having given her baby to a neighbor. Her husband was shot, and then that's where she met another man and had more children with him and was married then to him. He was in prison. You see what I'm saying, right? So it's just thousands and thousands and hundreds of thousands of people, ordinary people who didn't do anything wrong. In his case, I think he was a Polish communist and their turn had come, the cleaning out of the various people. He'd come from Poland to the Soviet Union, so it was their turn. He got dealt with. Just hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people having their lives ruined and their children's lives ruined and their wives' lives ruined simply because, that's what was happening in society. And if you compare that to the way that we live now, I just think it's such a shocking contrast, and that's why I'm careful to emphasize that by the 80s, it wasn't like that. But at the same time, the reason I talk about it is that, you think that had no impact on the way that I was raised? You think that the fact that this happened to all my family members had no impact on the way they lived their lives? You don't think there's an intergenerational passing down of all of those thoughts and ideas? People, I remember we had an interview here in the studio for trigonometry with a psychologist, and we talked about, the Russian smile, as I call it. The serious face. And I kept asking him, why do you think Russians are this way? Because as you probably know, Russians do tend to have other people from that part of the world. And he was like, well, it's history. This is a very traumatized society that's been traumatized for generations, and before the Soviet Union too. But it's just all this pain and misery and the brutality of people towards each other that has a horrific legacy.
What effect do you think it's had on you personally?
Well, I think I certainly wouldn't describe myself as someone who had a happy childhood. This modern idea of the thing for kids is to have fun. That wasn't really ever present in my life. My parents were preparing me for, yes, it wasn't the 30s, but they didn't know what was going to happen. And so they were preparing me for a harsh and brutal world in which there was a lot of cynicism, in which there was a lot of lying and deceiving and scheming and all of this other things. So I didn't have this kind of carefree childhood that my son is now having, thankfully, So
do you feel it's made you less trusting or
well, I am actually
more difficult to connect with people? Or
yeah, I think I was very fortunate. My parents sent me to the UK, where I was able to grow up here, really, from an older age. And so I've become too trusting, you might say, in some ways. But I think that definitely for a long period of my life, I felt wary and suspicious of people. Definitely. There was a very strong cynicism to me, and that definitely comes from my parents and from their parents before them and so on.
Mm-hmm. Can you, going back to your childhood and your actual memories, do you remember anything about this is rather prosaic after what we've just discussed, but do you remember anything about the living conditions, the food, queuing for food, or anything of that sort?
Yeah, well, first of all, there was almost no choice of anything. This is something that's completely inconceivable, I think, to the modern person, not only here in the West, but actually in Russia, in Ukraine, and lots of places. I'm sure there was less choice in Britain too than there was in the 1980s, but there was no choice. There were certain things. So, for example, every now and again, a particular item would be delivered to the shops. There would be, 5,000 sofas delivered to the local shop, and there would be a gigantic queue of people scrapping and trying to find ways to get a sofa. There was no choice of sofas. In fact, there were no sofas. Every now and again, some would be available for a very brief period of time for people, often who'd have to have the connections to get it. Most other goods were really very restricted and limited. There was almost no choice of anything. By this point, there were some farmers markets, but they were not the farmers markets of modern Britain. They were places where a few people would come and sell a few of their items. So you could top up what you'd buy in a normal shop, but the choice was very limited.
Did you have to queue at all? Do you remember queuing for food?
Yeah, of course.
Well, tell us. You may seem, of course, but I mean, to us, the idea of queuing for food. How long did you have to queue? Why did you queue as a child?
I remember. Well, I remember standing in line with my parents for an hour at a time sometimes.
To get what?
I I don't remember exactly, but food of some kind. Yeah, food of some kind.
And there was practically no choice of food.
No.
What about luxuries? Like, I say luxuries. What things could ordinary people have? Were they had washing machines, cars, televisions?
We didn't. So when we lived in Uzbekistan, we didn't have. I think we may have had a radio, maybe. We had one of those phones with the rotary dial.
Yeah.
That was quite advanced. The fact that we had one. Didn't have a TV from what I remember. No, I'm pretty sure we didn't have a TV. No, washing machines, definitely not. Dishwashers, forget about it. My grandmother, my great-grandmother, we'd go and visit her house. She lived in a private home, not in an apartment block. She didn't even have running water. The gas, I think, had got connected in a few years prior. I remember in Ukraine, my grandparents, I think my father, this wasn't even the Soviet Union anymore, it was the early 90s, my father paid for them to have a telephone line connected, and this was, direct. I remember their son-in-law had got them this amazing thing. They were just eternally grateful.
Wow. We take all this stuff for granted, but the economic underperformance of the communist states is obviously a subsidiary in importance to the terror. But it is worth noting that the sacrifices that people made in terms of terror and fear was not compensated for by material prosperity. Quite the opposite. It was actually had to add to the terror the economic failure.
Absolutely. And, I think comparatively speaking, one of the reasons that people weren't really generally allowed to travel outside the Soviet Union, unless they had some kind of special permission or whatever, is that the contrast was so shocking. And I really only understood this later when I was a student at Edinburgh University. I had a student job at a kids' trampoline thing. And I remember my manager at this place, he told me that he was in Berlin in the late 80s. And he actually was in East Berlin. And I remember him telling me and all the other staff, everyone was standing there just watching him. There was nothing, there was no choice in the shops. It was just awful. It was horrific. I couldn't believe it. And I was thinking in my head, my father was in East Berlin in the late 80s. And to him, he was in this land of plenty. Anyone who went to East Germany in the late 80s would come back with bags of stuff because it was the only place that you could get these things. So the contrast of these two people being in the same place at the same time, but one thought it was this land of luxury and the other thought there was nothing there, I think tells you in that one anecdote exactly the difference between those two societies. And of course, look, I think it's important to say and to acknowledge that physical comforts and material things are not everything. But I also think that if you've experienced real poverty, then you know that it's really genuinely quite horrific. And so we ought not to lose sight of that aspect of things as well. Yeah.
And what about, you mentioned travel. How easy was it for an ordinary Russian person to say, okay, I'm going to go on holiday in Italy this year?
Well, no, not only was it not easy, it was not possible. You could not leave the Soviet Union without special permission, which was very difficult to get. And you certainly wouldn't be going to go on holiday in Italy. You might be going as part of some organized trip to a particular place, usually to work or to do something. But it was people weren't allowed to leave. It was called the Iron Curtain for a reason.
Yeah. And I suppose it almost goes...
I'll tell you an anecdote on that point. Sorry,
sure.
James. I remember my grandfather, because he was a translator, he was allowed to travel, and I think he went to America once before the Soviet Union collapsed, and maybe to England once. And I remember him telling me the story of how he had a friend that I think maybe like a pen pal that he'd been communicating with through letters. And the first time, I think he was on his way to the United States, but obviously there was a layover somewhere. And he had a letter that he'd written on the plane because he knew that he was now finally in a place where his letters would not be read. And he was finally able to express himself fully. And he read this letter, and I remember him telling me the joy of taking that letter in that airport, in the connecting airport somewhere in the Western country, and putting it in the mailbox and sending it off, knowing that it was going to reach the destination, it would not be censored, it would not be read by anyone else. And just to him, that was like one of the great moments. It was a true freedom. It was a moment of true freedom, being able to post a letter knowing that other people are not going to read it.
Yeah.
That of it in and of itself. Can you imagine that? Being able to post a letter and for other person to get it and nobody else has read that letter. That was a great joy for him. That was the level of control that the Soviet Union exerted over its citizenry.
Yeah. Okay, so now I'm going to move on to the bigger and more difficult questions. Every communist society has ended up being a totalitarian terror state. Why? What is the process? What is the development? What takes people from an ideal of equality, brotherhood, fraternity to terror? What is the process? Why does it happen?
Well, I think one is the direct consequence of the other. The creation of artificial equality between people who are naturally unequal. Naturally. I mean, there is a natural distribution of skills, talents, intelligence, work ethic, diligence, etc. In order to equalize this unequal reality, you have to exert an awful lot of force, because people who are talented and hardworking and capable do not want to be equalized, so to speak. And in order to create that society, you have to use a lot of force, because what you're doing is extremely unnatural, and forcing productive people to give away almost everything they create while they observe in their very workplace other people who are not trying, who are not working hard, who are not as talented, who are not as capable as them, effectively be paid the same and treated the same. Creating that reality requires a hell of a lot of force. Now, look, I think another thing that ought to be acknowledged is it's not just about communism. I mean, in the 30s, what Stalin was doing was also dealing with revolutionaries, right? Once you've had a revolution, the revolutionaries become not only not useful, but they become a problem, because you've got these people who are, deeply enthusiastic about tearing things down and don't really know how to build anything. And so if you are trying to build anything, no matter how bad it is, you have to get rid of them. And I think that's part of the reason. But I think your point more broadly about the tendency towards totalitarianism is based on the fact that the society you're attempting to create is incredibly incompatible with human nature. And simply does not work at that sort of scale. Communism is probably great at the level of the individual family. Like my family is a communist society, if you like, right? In that, for the three people that exist in it, right? They all have very different roles, but they all share it in that. And maybe at the level of a small tribe like that, I think is it called a Dunbar number, like 150 tribal people, you might be able to do something like that. I think once you start to get beyond familial ties, having this idea that we must all we must put our neighbor before our children, so I don't think that's ever going to work. And if you're trying to force people to do that, you're going to very quickly find yourself having to use a hell of a lot of force.
I suppose if you go back to the collectivization of farms, which Lenin and most communist societies thereafter tried to copy, causing famines in many countries, in Russia, in China, in Vietnam, and Cuba, all sorts of places, North Korea. All these places have had famines. People have starved to death. And what you're doing when you collectivize a farm is you're going to one farmer and saying, sorry, that all that stuff you've built up over years, or perhaps your parents or grandparents helped build up, your farm, your animals, your crops that you've planted with care and love, you've got to give those all to a collective farm. So give it over now, and do it voluntarily, by the way.
And your labour too.
And your labour.
You have to give your labour, and then you get a small amount back that the government decides.
And there will be people who due to some aspect of human nature, which we may like or not like, but we are human and we have our human nature. And part of that is to say, I made this, I ought to be allowed to keep it. And so then you have the conflict which you describe, and you have the revolts that took place all over the place, certainly in Ukraine and elsewhere in the Soviet Union. The major revolts took place, which had to be put down with armed forces. And that, I think you're right to identify that as the moment when it goes from being an ideal to being a terror state.
That's right. And I think there's another aspect, I think, James, that's probably worth mentioning. And I've been thinking about this a lot because one of the big, I think, philosophical discussions and political discussions in this area is about the role of hierarchy. And in a healthy society, see, I think we've had a lot of kind of postmodernism in recent decades, in which sort of abhors hierarchy as a whole and is very keen on upending it or ending or creating a world with no hierarchy, which is what communism to some extent pretended to do as well. The problem is that I think hierarchy is an inevitable consequence of that bell curve distribution of talents and skills and everything I was talking about. And in a healthy society, hierarchy is based on merit. That's not to say that this perfect society exists exactly, because human nature and corruption and so on. But generally speaking, the idea is that there's a hierarchy of regard, you might say, which is based on public perception of contribution. In other words, I remember, for example, in my little town where I live, I used to play basketball in the local court in the park. And, I was just one of the guys and nobody particularly cared who I was or anything. And then I started to organize an annual basketball tournament for all the kids who played there. And suddenly I noticed that everyone started treating me differently. Right? Why was that? Well, they felt that I was doing something for others that was contributing to the entire ecosystem there, right? So in a healthy society, the more you help or the more you do for others, the higher your regard. And ideally, you get to a position where the people who are contributing the most are regarded the most. And that's what we mean by hierarchy. Now, what happens in a communist society is you deliberately create a perverse hierarchy. In other words, the people who are the most corrupt, the most willing to lie, the most willing to dob their neighbor into the authorities, the most willing to cheat, the most willing to steal, they become the ones in charge. They are the ones on top of the hierarchy. And the decent, honest, hardworking person becomes the bottom of the hierarchy. And the inevitable product of that is that society becomes less productive. It becomes less constructive in the way that it does things. And one of the reasons, I think, for the economic underperformance, if we put it diplomatically, of communist societies is that it creates a false hierarchy and with perverse incentives, where the cream sits at the bottom and quite often is eliminated, literally eliminated, and all of the, I won't say what, rises to the top and governs everything.
Yeah, and one aspect of hierarchy that existed in the Soviet Union was although wages were more similar, in theory at least, in practice the officials had special shops where they could get things which ordinary people couldn't get. Is that not right?
Well, yes, it was actually a very brief period in my family's time when we lived after the Soviet Union collapsed, so it wasn't nearly what it was, in the former dacha of a former member of the Politburo for like a year. And we discovered, to my surprise, that there were these special, I think they were called spецраспределители, special distribution shops where you'd get special food. The party bosses could have access to Western movies, which were not available to anyone. Pornography, of course, inevitably, and so on. They had all access to all these evil products of Western capitalism that they enjoyed in the privacy of their government dachas. So yes, the idea that everyone was equal and all of this stuff, as we see around the world in all these places where you have these populist kind of revolutionary people who say that we must create equality between people. They all live in palaces, inevitably. And that's because there's something probably quite natural in some ways about a hierarchy in which, like there are countries in which you couldn't be the leader of a country unless you live in a palace because no one will respect you. You know what I mean? And I think there's something pretty normal about that there is a kind of, the people in different roles in society are accorded different incomes and all of this stuff. It's the natural way that this thing works. Right? I'm not saying it's good or bad or whatever. It just seems to be that in a society in which you have people rewarded for merit, ideally, I'm saying ideally because it doesn't always work that way, then that will happen, right, over time. I'm not sure that that's necessarily universally a good thing, but is it better than everything else that's available? Probably it is.
You've referred to human nature being against communism in one sense.
Yeah.
Is there another sense in which human nature is against communism in the desire for freedom? You were not allowed, people in the Soviet Union were not allowed to travel abroad freely. They were not allowed to say what they wanted. And is there a natural impulse, at least it may vary from one human being to another, but some human beings at least have an urge to be free, to do what they want?
I think that's a very important nuance that you introduced into this, because it's a big debate, as I'm sure you're aware, in the current political environment and culturally and philosophically, about whether, whether freedom is this unbridled good. I think many people don't perceive it as being that, particularly when, safety, prosperity, etc., are not on the table. So people who are poor and starving, they don't really care as much about freedom as they care about solving those problems first. And I think there are some people who actually crave a certain conformity and someone to tell them what to do, and tell them what to think and not have to worry too much. However, I think the point that you make is absolutely right, which is there is a quite big group of people for whom the freedom to make their own decisions about things is really quite, not just quite important. There is, I think, a group of people for whom it is a non-negotiable. And those people suffer the most, of course, in these sort of societies. Now, what the psychological underpinnings are there, I imagine that there's some element of, it's a more appealing worldview for people who feel a sense of agency of their own lives, for people who want to be free to fail or succeed on their merit because they suspect that they will likely succeed. I suspect that there are some people whose posture towards the world is the opposite of that, for whom a more controlled environment is much more appealing because they're going to be looked after. And this is one of the criticisms that I have, I think, for us in Europe, actually. The difference, I think, between Europe and America is that many, but this is one of them, which is in Europe, we don't really want to be unleashed to do the things that we want to do, which is the attitude mostly in America that I see. We just want to be looked after more than anything. And I think it's that tension that communism caters to. It says, you have to worry, you're definitely not going to fail, because no matter how bad you are at your job, no matter how lazy you are, no matter what you do, you're going to be fine. I don't want to live in that society, but I think there are quite a lot of people who do want to live in that society. And I think that's probably one of the reasons that this idea of people invent different names for it, because communism kind of has a bad rep, well earned, I think. We keep coming round and round to this idea over and over. And you look around in the modern world, there are people who want to send people that message, who are becoming very popular on social media nowadays.
Well, talking of which, there are people on the left. I mean, I prove this as a matter of fact, but as far as I can tell, there are people who are on the left, maybe social democrats, who think of themselves as being on the same spectrum as communists. They're not so far along it. Communism is just taking it a bit far, but they think they're on the same line. They don't think that they are something completely different. Are they right?
Yes, absolutely. Of course they are.
Well, don't you think there's a difference between accepting democracy and being a communist? Don't you think there's a difference between allowing free speech and being a communist? Being allowed to travel and being a communist? I mean, these seem to me major differences.
I think so, yes, but I think that if their ideas are taken to the logical conclusion. See, I don't think most people in the Soviet Union, I know the leaders of the Russian Revolution had no problem with, ending free speech and terror and all of that. They thought it was totally fine and necessary. They were living more than 100 years ago, to be fair, right? When this was pretty commonplace, in Russia. It's not like they took a democratic and peaceful and open society and made it into that. They continued, and in some cases made it worse. But of course, there's a difference between the 1930s in the Soviet Union and a social democrat, or even a modern communist, I suspect, in the sense that there are certain things that they would accept, at least for now, when they're not in power. Right, but if they were to be in power and attempting to implement their policies, they would quickly find that they're facing the same problem, which is a lot of people don't want to do this, and you're going to have to ratchet up the amount of power that you use in order to achieve your ends. Are they willing to create gulags? Well, at this point, I don't think there's any evidence of that.
But you're talking about people who aren't real communists. Real communists are willing to have a violent revolution. This is in the manifesto, a violent revolution to impose a socialist society in which people do not have substantial amount of property. So you're talking about sort of would-be communists, pretend communists. You're talking about real communists.
Well, it's very hard to know.
They're talking about Marxist communists, ones who follow the violent revolution that is recommended by Marx in the Communist Party manifesto.
Yeah, but there are a lot of people who will say, well, I want all the objectives achieved. I don't want to end democracy. I want us to vote for this communist utopia. So I think you can be a communist, or at least pretend to be one.
I think it is a pretend to be one. I'm sorry, I have to be a rigorous describer of communism. Communism is a violent revolution to overthrow the property-owning classes. And that is just
what if you could vote for that?
Explicit in if you could vote for that, you would still be taking it from the people who didn't want to give it up.
Well, but it was through the democratic process, is what they would argue, right?
Yeah. But I don't think that has never happened.
No,
it is no communist power has ever come to power through a democratic vote, because people don't vote. Turkeys do not vote for Christmas, and it's exactly the same thing. Most people have some vested interest in some property, and they don't want to give it up.
Well, I hope you continue to be right, James.
So do I. But let me one other thing is if you read the Communist Party manifesto, it has a long description about how wrong various other theorists of the extreme left are. But Marx wishes to make sure that all the other extreme leftists are put down and disagree with comprehensively, and it calls for a violent revolution. And then it says there will be a period of socialism in which the state owns everything, and then this will inevitably result in a communist society where there is no property. People will just share things, full stop. There is no detailed description at any point in that manifesto of what a communist society would actually be once it makes the transition from socialism to communism, which, by the way, has never happened in any country. But what I'm asking you is it a coincidence that there has never been a detailed description of what a communist society would actually look like if we ever got there?
I don't think it's a coincidence. And I think it's because it's a utopian vision. That, again, as we discussed, look, the way you describe it, like I say, it sounds like a family, right? You share things with your wife and children in a way that you don't really care so much about the ownership of them or who made them or whatever. That works at the level of the family. I do not think that works at the level of society. And so this is a utopian vision in which people effectively suspend their human nature, suspend their bonds to their family and loved ones in order to fulfill the needs and wishes of the state and in this great utopia. It's just, I don't think it's reality.
I mean, if there really was no property, I could ask you now for your mobile phone, and I could walk out with it. Because it's in any real sense yours. It's communal property. Right. I could take away the table, the camera lights, camera and the lights. Take away that picture over there. It's not yours. Well, and you in this fantasy world would not object because
it would never be mine in the first place, right? It would would be allocated to me by the state. Look, James, I understand the rhetorical kind of back and forth that you and I are having, but I think one thing we ought to acknowledge, and this will sound a little bit snooty in some ways, but whenever I've talked to these people, the Ash Sarkars of the world, about this issue, I've always discovered that they haven't really thought very carefully about it at all. For example, I remember having a debate with Ash on the moral maze, in which we were talking about, she said, well, if you have a fridge full of food, is it not the government's job to make you give that food to the homeless and the poor? And I said to her, well, do you have a front door in your house? She said, yes. And I said, well, shouldn't the government put loads of homeless people in your house in violation of that? And I don't think it registers. They just haven't thought it through, because this isn't something where they've thought constructively about the solution that they're aiming for. They see a problem, which is inequality, people suffering, and they go, well, we must solve this. How do we solve this? Well, other people have more, therefore they have to give it, and they don't think about it more than that. I think we are pretending that this is a coherent political philosophy that has tangible, practical, real-world applications that have been explored and thought about. I don't think that's the case at all. I think this is pure ideology.
Yeah, and Marx very obviously made no effort to think about what it would actually consist of. In fact, avoided doing that. But he assumed. I mean, it is extraordinary when you think of a large part of human history in the 20th century was given over to experimenting with communism, and nobody had thought through what it might be like or whether it would actually work.
Well, communism and fascism, and I think the reason is, I think we ought to say, I think this is important to say, that it's not like communism and fascism came out of nowhere. It was a response, I think, to the Industrial Revolution and the tremendous disruption that had, and the kind of increasing sense that as societies were urbanizing and people were moving from the countryside into the cities, it was changing the way that people thought about freedom, the way that they thought about rights, the way that they thought about economics, the way they thought about equality, the fact that they could now see how much better the lives of other people around them were in a way that a peasant in rural Russia never would have done. So these ideologies don't come out of nowhere, but they are based on exactly the same problem that we just discussed, which is they are reactionary to the status quo without having any constructive dimension to them. They had some nice ideas, or some terrible ideas, about how societies would be when we ended the current problem, but they had no real vision that was accurate or workable for how to improve things. And it's sad that I think humanity unfortunately seems to move in these ways. We lurch from one extreme to another, to another, to another. And that pendulum that everyone keeps talking about, the way it swings like from left to right or wherever, it does seem, someone said on our show recently, it does seem to spend very little time in the middle.
Very good. Okay, well, thank you very much, Konstantin.
Thanks for having me.